My Family Thinks I'm Crazy, a podcast where I, your host, try to give you some tips on how you can explain all this weird, wild, crazy conspiracy stuff to the people you love most. Because that's what I've been trying to do for the past 10 years with no success.
I've been telling everybody that our government is shady, but every time I do, my family thinks I'm crazy. The hollow earth, UFOs, aliens invading, fluoride in the water, they swear skies daily. When I talk about these things, they think I'm crazy. There's no escaping anymore the evil that we're facing. Illuminati mind control, they're sacrificing babies. The end of days, but anyways, my family thinks I'm crazy.
What, they don't want to listen to you?
No, they don't want to listen. They don't want to hear it. They're just like, oh, here we go, Mark. Off again with your...
Mark being Mark again.
Yeah. So, that's the thing about podcasts is when you're on the air, it's like therapy, If I can't talk to my family about this stuff, I'll talk to you, Matt, and all our listeners.
You just tell your whole podcast.
Yeah. So who are we talking about today, Matt?
They think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. My family thinks that I'm crazy.
If we define shamanism as, and I do, as right relation or extra-dimensional diplomacy, right? So going back to the idea that there are persons that aren't humans, and they can be spirits, they can be trees, they can be caribou, they can be whatever. The role of the shaman, he or she mediates and negotiates. So it's a diplomatic role with the rest of the cosmos that includes spirits, that includes such as they are different to plant teachers, prey animals, all the rest of it, right? And that is, when I say that, this comes back to the language use, right? That is a universal, on the one hand we can say that is a universal human custom. But when you call it a custom, what you're actually doing is lifting it up from the base level of biological as a thing that we can do, and we might just do something else, like it's learning a language. It's one step removed from something far more internal, which is, I think that's what humans are. I think humans fulfill a cosmic or cosmological ecological niche of being that kind of ceremonial mediator.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. I'm your host, Mark Palmer, and we all come to this show because our families think we're crazy, right? So let's have a little bit of fun while we're learning how to convince them that we're not. And that is easier when you have brilliant folks like today's guest. You can find him at RuneSoup.com, but you can join his exclusive membership group where you'll get a lot of what you hear of on this show and what you might see in his RuneSoup blog in the form of a course. You can learn about UFOs, fairies, custodianship, angel magic, wealth magic, the tarot, our ancestors, working with the dead, magical geography, saints, grimoires, journeying, sigils, and so much more. It was a pleasure talking to him. It was a pleasure getting to know him. For those who may be unfamiliar with today's guest, Gordon White first became interested in Western occultism at the age of 13 following a series of intense dream experiences, and this interest became a lifelong pursuit. His esoteric leanings found an inspirational overlap with his exploration of the Pacific following the publication of Graham Hancock's classic Fingerprints of the Gods. This led him to study documentary production at a university level, film an underwater documentary about non-Madal, and then go on to work for BBC Magazine, Discovery Channel, and news media companies in both hemispheres. After moving to London, he held senior data and analytics positions in global media companies, as well as starting a chaos magic blog and podcast called RuneSoup. That's how I first heard about him, after being interviewed on Greg Carlwood's the Higher Side chats talking about this blog and all of the awesome subjects that they cover in this RuneSoup blog. So definitely check that out. And while you're at it, check out his 3 books, The Chaos Protocols, Starships, A Prehistory of the Spirits, and Pieces of 8, as well as he mentioned in this interview, 2 projects that are soon to be released. A new book called Animystic, diving into a lot of the topics we covered today, landscape metaphysics and the spirit of place and things, as well as a oracle deck of Lenormand cards that he is creating in a really cool way through a podcast video series. So go check that out on his YouTube channel. And here for the first time to discuss all things animistic, enjoy this conversation with Gordon White. Before we get to that, folks, I just want to thank all of our awesome patrons for showing us some love on Patreon. So many of you are there, and on Rockfin too. Shout out to everyone on Rockfin. If you'd like, sign up for Patreon. Not only do you get all of our amazing bonus content, but you get a spirit animal name as well. So come join the family. I know you won't regret it. Tons of bonus content. And here we are, folks. We've got sponsors. It's 2022, and we'll never do ads on this show, but sponsors, we could have a few sponsors here and there. They're not permanent. So I want to tell you about our sponsors. I know 2022, you're probably thinking, what the heck's going on? What do I have to expect this year? It seems like some crazy stuff's going to happen. They said it's going to be a dark winter. Well, set your positivity compass, or reset your positivity compass with Audrey Lobdell's Reiki and Tuning Fork sessions. Check her out. The link is in the description. And while you're at it, spice up the vibes of wherever you're at with our holistic healing resources at Akasha Goods. Link also in the description. And it's a little cold, but if you like the forest in winter, hit up Fru for a forest bath. That's right, Fru's Forest Bathing. Maybe get some consultation from her over the internet, or maybe you can drive out and book it in person and get down in the forest with Fru. Last but not least, we have crystal-infused essential oils by our patron, One Thumb L. Go check her out. We give her 2 thumbs up. So that does it for the sponsors. Quick, painless, and on to this awesome conversation with Gordon White. Oh, and folks, listen, if you sign up for the Patreon this month, in the month of January, if you sign up by January 15th, 2022, you'll be in the running for a raffle. That's right. We have hand-printed t-shirts that I printed myself. Tara helped me print the t-shirts. She did one herself. Her design came out fantastic. And we're going to be raffling off these t-shirts for our patrons. We have 2 t-shirts that are going to be raffled off and a surprise gift as well. So if you sign up for the Patreon by January 15th, 2022, you can be in the runnings for some free merch. That's right. As long as you're above the $5 tier, you will be put in the raffle running. So sign up now for above the $5 tier. That's the best way to get all the bonus content anyways. So thank you. And that's it. Enjoy this conversation with Gordon White. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. I'm your host, Mark Palmer, and on today's show is a man who hosts his own podcast. He's written several books, as well as the head of a very interesting school. I hope he tells us much more about it. It's all on his membership site. It's a great community from what I've heard. He's a staple in this community, in my opinion, and I've really enjoyed looking over his book, Chaos Magic. So Gordon, thank you so much for joining me here today. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Mark.
No problem. Does your family think you're crazy, Gordon?
So my mother's an energy healer and my father's a retired psychiatrist. So no, if you've been doing it for long enough. Here's the thing. I'll periodically have a very good relationship with my father, so don't read it this way, but I will periodically have a big argument about something. The CIA's involvement in psychiatry, something like that. And he'll deny it. And he'd be like, that's not true. And I'm like, okay. And then a month or so later, he will have worked out that I, in fact, was correct, and so on. So my father will temporarily think I'm crazy about some things, but no, I kind of blend in. The rest of the family, like the siblings and so on, I think it helps having an energy healer mother and so on. So if they think I'm crazy, it's a benign crazy. But you know, there are predictive techniques in the world, like we were just talking before you hit record, like astrology and so on, that you only have to spend a little bit of time with them to realize there's something to it. And they've kind of got that experience after several decades of like, well, he's going to say some odd stuff, but he's been right before. And that's generally where I'm at with my family.
I love that. Yeah, I hope to gain that credibility myself. I mean, definitely helps. It sounds like cunning folk runs in your blood. And I've heard you discuss this before. I remember first coming across this term when looking through, I think, Wicca by Scott Cunningham and hearing about this and being from New England, in America, it has a similar mystique and it really felt interesting to me. But the more I learned about Wicca, the more I learned it was really shamanism. I mean, it's just rebranded shamanism, and I find it really fascinating how much work you've done with shamanism. So I'm interested to take that apart. When you say energy healer, is it a shamanistic type practice that your mother takes part in? What would her particular flavor?
Well, it's funny, like that hinges on how you define shamanism, right? Because when you say Wicca is basically shamanism, I sort of think of the Spider-Man meme, where actually, if you think of the 20th century understanding of shamanism, it's Wicca and Wicca's it, and they're pointing at each other, right? Because they actually sort of evolved out of the same almost like historical moment in the post-war West, and there's a sort of like a rise of popular anthropology and all the rest of it, right? So for good and for ill, because there's a lot to be critiqued in the 20th century application of the word shamanism to everything. Now, having said that, just to answer your question, you can, with certain caveats, use a category term like shamanism to talk about spiritual techniques, or even just, not that there's any difference with this, even just herbalisms around the world, right? So in that sense, my mother's practice isn't shamanic. She's the core discipline is called pranic healing, but pranic healing, quote unquote, works the same way shamanic modalities and animist modalities have worked around the world since forever. So it's not an explicitly shamanic framework, but it works because the word shamanism, we use it to describe something that's true, which is that humans have these capacities, and people with practice can kind of like get better at them.
I agree. I think it is important, and people kind of lump it all into one. It all connects to us. It doesn't really matter which culture it is. It seems that wherever we look on the planet, we find these sort of modalities interacting with the herbal world, the, mineral kingdom, even the, celestial kingdom. And that's why I'm really excited to talk to you about your new book, Animystic. Most people, when you tell them like something like a crystal has a consciousness, they just sort of write it off. The average person who's not aware of what we're talking about here, possibly. But there is something really true and impactful about not just crystals, but the land, inanimate things that we would consider inanimate objects having conscious aspects to them. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd phrase it differently, and that's literally why I wrote a whole book about it. And it's such an electrifying term, animism, right? And it's really, I'm glad, Mark, that we actually picked up a book to look into it, because that's basically what my whole new book swings on, which is the term is really dark, right? So the term emerges from basically the 19th century European early anthropologists basically trying to understand why brown people are stupid compared to white people. Like, so there are cultures who don't understand the difference between dreams and reality, and they think trees have personalities and all this kind of stuff. So the word comes from the most profoundly racist part of European history, and it's a word used to describe what they would have considered to be a naive worldview or a naive theory of mind. Now, why it's electrifying to stay with the trouble of that term now is that it's a cosmic joke. We were wrong. Like the people with the naive theory of mind were the 19th century Europeans who thought we lived in some kind of like clockwork universe that was sort of like their steam trains just running on power and gradually powering down, and that there was no intelligence or anything. And it's just the most ludicrous cosmology and theory of mind ever. And we're still in the shadow of that, right? We're still in the rain shadow, if you will, of this kind of really dumb idea. And so the term is potent to stay with because it forces like us as a quote unquote culture to look at how we think about beings that aren't human, how we think about other humans, what it means to be here, and also why we have to think about that now is the kind of like the political journey we've been on. So the term itself is electrifying, and I wouldn't say. The trouble with saying it's to do with objects having a consciousness is that it's not exactly. That's still stuck in a Western theory of mind, right? So I'll give you the definition and then I'll explain the definition because it's a bit annoying. So Graham Harvey would say that animism is the extension of personhood beyond the human, right? So and thanks largely to Descartes, with I think therefore I am and so on, we think that human and person is the same thing. Now, no other culture anywhere in the world, anywhen, including our own, ever thought that up until 300 years ago. And quite literally, the people who were followed on from Descartes thought that your dog was literally some kind of like meat robot with no just instincts and no personality and no personhood. See that it's there in the word. It is a metaphysical statement. Personhood isn't biologically determined to be just in humans, right? Like this is it's a metaphysical framework. So I can say a tree is a person, and I don't have to, the first time you hear that, you go, well, no, it isn't, because I don't mean that it went to the same school I did. And like, Breaking Bad, what I mean is that there are persons in the universe. In fact, the universe is made up of persons, only some of whom are human. So that's kind of different to, not that you can't have rocks that have spirits in them, but animism as a framework of personhood can exist without having to kind of like make statements about the kind of intelligent capacity of crystals. It's literally, how do you define a person? Because the pet owners listening to this would be like, well, yeah, of course my pet is some kind of person. And that's animism. That's just what it is at its base. You could, although this is quite difficult having just said this, technically you could be some sort of like, you could be an animist without an understanding or even a quote unquote belief in spirits, right? And why that's a technicality is that spirits are formulated differently in cosmologies that aren't dualist. So we think of a spirit as some kind of being that doesn't have, that can be put in an object, right? Like a genie in a lamp or a consciousness in a crystal. But for an animist, certain crystals are persons, right? So it's actually, it's almost like, it's sort of like riding a bike, right? The first time you do it, quite challenging to kind of like make that pivot into an animist framework. But then once you're there, it makes complete sense. We move into it with the felt awareness that the more than human world, the trees and other animals and so on are a kind of being. But then we come into it with the framework that we grew up with, and we try to like add some magic to it or add some supernatural to it. Like, well, this tree has a consciousness in it. It's like, no, the tree is a being. Let's start just with this basic biological idea that the tree is a being. And then it kind of builds or emerges from there. And it is a fundamentally different kind of being to a human and to a horse and so on. And for me, that's animism. And why it's so urgent now is that it's a framework that cries out for self-healing, and these are fraught words, but an improved environmental relationship. And it contains with it the thing that I think people were looking for in the 20th century as they went appropriating all these kind of cultures with the rise of things like neo-shamanism and Wicca and so on. It is the right medicine for right now to kind of like stay with this term. That's why it's a whole book and a very lengthy answer.
I agree, and I definitely am excited to look into that further. I don't want to go into it too much because we want people to check out the book, but I think it's important to go back to the beginning of what you just said, because I fundamentally agree with what you said. I mean, how I came into this whole world of different perspectives and theories was through an experience I had in college, just being sort of on the, basically a few months away from dropping out, smoking joints in between classes. And I ran into this guy who told me he's from Arizona. He's a Native American guy. And we got to talking about all sorts of things. We started talking about skull and bones. We started talking about how his ancestor Geronimo had been, grave robbed and brought to this fine establishment, Yale University, which I wasn't in that school, but I was, on the precipice of it. And you kind of rub shoulders with those types. And it was very, very stark and kind of depressing to find out some of the things that actually went on in the colonial days, and then they just get sort of swept under the rug, and these big universities are built, and they'll have some museum exhibits that kind of show the artwork of these people, but it's really frustrating, and I think now more than ever, especially with the podcast community, you see people trying to reconnect with the earth. And they see that cultures that haven't been, let's say, tainted by the Western ideologies, wherever that started, have this sort of deeper connection with the earth. So naturally, you see people gravitating towards, indigenous cultures, whether it be, here in North America, South America, even Asia, and where you're at in Australia. And even, further back, if we look into the history books, we see the same thing happened in Europe. So it's really a universal thing, this, sort of earth culture that slowly got more and more separated from its connection with Earth Mother. I feel like maybe now I'm giving you a sort of lengthy rant without a question here, but would you agree with that? And what do you think, caused this disconnect that left those 19th century thinkers so in the dark about what these cultures were actually experiencing and interacting with?
Well, I'll answer the so the difference between the 20th century and now when it comes to looking at, I wouldn't say tainted or untainted because there's sort of nowhere left really. There's like 3 tribes in the Amazon. What in the 20th century, we looked at the disenchantment of the post-war, particularly in the United States, the post-war boom and era, and it was very acquisitional, hyper-capitalist and so on. And the counterculture and hippies and what have you went in a different direction. And within that is the kind of Carlos Castaneda shamanism thing. Now, we're at a similar moment now, but it's a question of the difference between taking and learning from, right? So, and this is the appropriative challenge. In the 20th century, we didn't, like the last thing that we had to take from the descendants of Geronimo was their culture. So we did. So it's like, okay, cool. I'll hang up the dream catchers and I'll put a sweat lodge in the backyard and, and I'm whiter than Julie Andrews, but this is what I do now. And that is, we thought that was like a good thing to do, but it's actually the final, we took everything else and that's the last thing to take, right? So that's the difference between learning and taking from. So when we talk about things like disconnect, there's sort of challenges with that word because we're at a point where, okay, cool. How then do we learn from cultures that have been more severely impacted by the colonial process? Because they clearly have urgent medicine for us and for them that they're willing to share. It's not like, hey, tell me all your secrets. Like the whole book is actually about the things that the challenge with how to learn in a non-extractive way. How do we have cross-cultural encounters that are co-enriching, right? And this is coming around to, I guess, the second point. Sort of, we do that by recognizing within our own, at least initially, recognizing within our own historical journey as we're just saying we have a shared culture here, but you only need to go back 350 years to find a Europe that or Britain, and even to some extent, although obviously the colonial project was well underway by then, even in the New World, to find people who actually did understand the rhythms of the seasons. And so like all the Christian festivals and astrological signs and all the rest of it are kind of tied to the movement of seasons. So we used to do it. That's kind of the key. And a key part of that, we mentioned cunning traditions at the beginning, which we should get back to, is to recognize not to become like an Iroquois medicine woman, but into the knowledge that is available from, say, an Iroquois medicine woman, and kind of go, well, what is that saying about the world, and how do I sit with that? And is this something that we had or have or used to? Like, it's a conversation between equals, right? Hence the book. But like how we came to it is also in the book. Is I use a paraphrase Hemingway for how it is we as the Westerners came to this terrible situation. And the answer is Hemingway, slowly at first, and then all at once. Like, how did you go bankrupt? Slowly at first, then all at once, is essentially how we ended up in this situation. Because you can make a very good, and I do make a very good critique of classical Greek thought and its sort of separation of the physical or the material from the holy, right? And in fact, it's a radical theologian, Matthew Fox, said the worst thing Christianity did was inherit the idea from the Greco-Roman world that the physical is far from the sacred. And we got that from the Greeks. Everyone wanders around saying it was the Christians who did it. No, they just inherited it, right? And so that's the slowly at first. The all at once is essentially the Enlightenment, and it's essentially Descartes. Like, you got to pin the blame on someone, and Descartes' a fun one to pin the blame on, because what he was actually trying to do was the opposite. He was trying to, good Catholic boy that he was trying to save God, because there he is at the beginning of the Enlightenment, and all these geologists and biologists are saying like, oh, the world is X million years old and blah, blah, blah. And it's all contrary to, obviously, the faith of his childhood, which would be biblically described. So he set about trying to like go, okay, well, if they're essentially desacralizing and desupernaturalizing the natural, where do I find God? And that's where like he went through to get to, I think, therefore I am, was a process of essentially trying to prove God. Unfortunately, that's as good a point as any to say, okay, well, what he's done then is turn the entire universe into effectively a machine that God sets. And so that's how we get to where we are. Slowly at first with the Greek era, then all at once with the Enlightenment. And it's that's the answer for it. It's fascinating because why it is that this one little corner of the world came up with literally like the most naive and stupidest, particularly like remember the new atheists in like the early noughties? We can consider that the peak of it, where people would literally stand up and with their consciousness and say that consciousness is like an epiphenomena of like brain chemicals, and it's just the dumbest, most pathological worldview I think anyone has ever come up with, and that's how we got to it. So we've got a long climb out of it, and there are, I hope, we need to learn how to learn, and then we need to learn from cultures that didn't make such a silly mistake, I think.
I would agree. Yeah, I would like to see, how we can turn this into maybe teaching myself and the listeners how we can use some of those cunning folk lessons maybe applied through that lens, because you're absolutely right. You find that no culture is separate from this way of life that is more interconnected with the earth. I think it's why that subject was so fascinating to me, shamanism, because I saw how universal it was. It's just, it's
Yes.
like an underlying current in every culture.
Yes. So if we define shamanism as, and I do, like as right relation or extra-dimensional diplomacy, right? So going back to the idea that there are persons that aren't humans, and they can be spirits, they can be trees, they can be caribou, they can be whatever. The role of the shaman, he or she mediates and negotiates. So it's a diplomatic role with the rest of the cosmos. That includes spirits, that includes such as they are different to plant teachers, prey animals, all the rest of it, right? And that is, when I say that, it's this comes back to the language use, right? that is a universal, on the one hand, we can say that is a universal human custom. But when you call it a custom, what you're actually doing is lifting it up from the base level of biological as a thing that we can do, and we might just do something else, like it's learning a language. It's one step removed from something far more internal, which is, I think that's what humans are. I think humans fulfill a cosmic or cosmological ecological niche of being that kind of ceremonial mediator. And that's a thing that I learned from various Aboriginal Australian nations' understandings of what it is to be in corroboree and in ceremony and so on. But even the words, this is the challenge, even the words we bring to try to understand it have come from this 18th century academic tradition that does this separating and pulling apart. Like, I don't want to call it a universal human practice. I want to say, because I think it's clearer and more correct, that this is what humans do, and we're just not doing it. Like, witness what we've done to the planet, right? And that's a crucial difference. And that's one of the ways I would like that we can learn with and co-exchange with cultures outside of the so-called West, is to kind of realize that on a base level, humans are supposed to be that. Not every single person should be a shaman, but culturally we are supposed to be in right relation with everything else in the cosmos.
Right. Yeah. And I think, you're articulating things that have been in my mind for many years, and
you're going to like the bookmark.
You're articulating it much better than I can. So I love that you're here right now. I want to switch gears a little bit, though, because I did ask you if we could go over your book, The Chaos Protocols, because like I said, I picked it up. I enjoy it. And I'm seeing, as I flip through the pages, how it's connecting to, where we're going, where we're heading with this transhumanist maybe agenda. I'm wondering, in hindsight, with everything that's happened in the past 2 years, do you think there's, some things that you touched on in your book there that are sort of ringing true more than you thought?
Oh, yeah, sure. From the second it came out, and then America went insane with
right,
panicking over the Trump election and so on. Like, it was all there. But funnily enough, the beginning chapter, which is the lengthiest one, kind of trying to give a top-level overview of the why of the book, like the economic currents and so on, where that's what the so-called Great Reset is about. Like, the Western governments, particularly European governments, can no longer fund themselves because they've destroyed their bond market. So they're literally, this is what moving into a central bank digital currency is, to keep this game running, because they can't fund themselves anymore. And that's the Klaus Schwab angle, right? That's what the CBDCs are about, and Klaus Schwab and so on. And the whole book is about, we are fucked, because not like the whole book is about we are fucked. Like, that chapter is explaining that people find the bond market really, really boring, because on the one hand it is, but on the other hand, this is how governments fund themselves. And consequently, the bondholders are the people who kind of like run governments. So it's everyone, particularly in conspiracy world, wants it to be a global cabal of satanic pedophiles meeting up somewhere and running the world. And it's not like there isn't, elite sexual abuse and trafficking and all the rest of it, of course. But actually, very often how the world is run and why people do things is available to us. It's just boring. And we want it to be Hillary Clinton sacrificing children or whatever, right? When in fact it's just, well, who actually owns the most US bonds? And it's very difficult to find that. Countries have to kind of publicly submit that they own bonds and whatever, but actually it's their private assets. You don't actually know who owns which bonds, right? And that whole process is kind of coming to an end. So I think about the first chapter a lot, and the kind of like Great Reset, Rockefeller Reset, the table stuff to do with the food and debasement. And I think I'm actually pretty happy from 5 years out with where it's gone or been. What I don't think anyone expected. I knew the when, and we could talk about that later, but I didn't know the what. No one expected a pandemic narrative would be used to imprison most of the population of the world for 2 years, right? Like, so that was the unexpected play. I figured it was going to be something biological, but I didn't think it would be that. So that the economic or the sort of magical strategies that can be deployed in like a specific sort of corporate infrastructure, which is kind of like the second half of the book, are still in play, but the field on which you kind of like go to war is different. I think that workplaces have fundamentally changed and access to them has fundamentally changed depending on whether or not you're rejected and all the rest of it. But the baseline idea of like seeing what's going on in the world and then reclaiming that, which is the birthright of every single human, reclaiming that, we might as well call it magical capacity. And any other word beyond that is like too, it over describes it. So when I say magical capacity, I include prayer in that. I include intentionality. It's not just, killing chickens at a crossroad, right? It's humans coming back to that idea. What we are is a being that is constantly in hyperdimensional or extra-dimensional diplomacy. We are in relation to much, much bigger forces all the time. And that's what I mean by it being a human birthright. We express that with things like prayer, but we can also express it with like more explicit acts of magic.
Wow. Yeah, a lot to go back, but to go back to what you said about the why, because I think you're hinting at something there. And I think has to do with the astrological forecast. And I guess I'll just ask you, why was 2020 so important for them to make this happen now? Like what, I assume that's where you're alluding to.
No, I meant more that, so there's a couple of astrological, because it was 2020. Yes. There are some models outside of astrology that I'm really interested in all cycle models. I like Kondratiev waves. I like, my favorite at the moment is, and has been for years, is Martin Armstrong's AI run, or Socrates run economic confidence model. So astrology is at its base, if you look at where it came from historically, the observation of what's going on in the night sky and the recording of what's going on the planet at that time. And over centuries and millennia, you start to see that when this little yellow dot is here, these things happen, and when this little red dot, it moves like that, these things happen. And so astrology is generated based on, or was generated based on real world data in Babylon and so on, right? And which makes it an economic cycle model, and it makes economic cycle models like the Kondratiev wave astrology, because it's the same idea. It's like observing when these things happen, they tend to go together, right? And so the Armstrong's model has very specific dates about when certain things are going to happen and turning points and whatever. It got January 6th. It got the crash that came at the beginning of 2020 in Q1 and all the rest of all these things that kind of happen, fascinating turning points, right? So that's what I meant by, I knew the when. The story of this decade is the story of, by the end of it, there will be fewer stars on the flag, right? Like America is heading towards divorce and Beijing is heading towards being financial capital of the world. I hope we get to that. That's just what happens. Like the westward movement of capital has been going on for centuries. Like it went from, let's just start it in Babylon or Egypt, and then it moved through Rome, and then it moved through Spain, and then it moved through Britain, and then it moved through the east coast of the US. We're coming out of the west coast of the US, rise of Silicon Valley, and it's jumping to the east coast of Asia, right, to Beijing. Capital moves, this is one of those cycles. On a cycle of centuries, it just keeps moving west, right? And it'll be in Asia for about 400 years, and then it'll get back to Europe. That's what happens. So I hope we can get to that next stage without calamitous nuclear wars, because that's what we have to do this decade, is move into a multipolar world. And the people in charge don't want to, and even if they did, they aren't up to the task. So that's kind of what I meant by, I knew the when and the what. Didn't expect a few people I think expected a pandemic narrative being used as air cover for the attempted sort of like reorganization of it. Because you need to realize that what the G7 is trying to do is maintain control of a world where all the growth comes from G20. So if you are going to these meetings like Davos and so on, you look at the post-industrial European nations with aging populations. So Germany is the second oldest in the world after Japan. And you look at where all the growth is, economic growth, demographic growth. So countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, the average age of a citizen is like 21, I think, whereas it's like 49 or something, or 46 in Germany, right? So if your job is planning and you're looking at this, you're like, okay, cool. Well, then how do we manage growth how do we maintain control when growth is over there? And the things you put in place, a digital currency control system that is tied to carbon compliance, right? Because it's all well and good for Western countries who've deindustrialized to now go, look at us, we're also green. It's like, well, you're not though, are you? You're just getting your stuff made in countries that still run things in coal factories and the rest of it. So that's the pivot. They're trying to keep their game running with this new technological thing. And they have to do it now because China is doing the same thing, right? Like China's building out its own version of SWIFT. It's already got its social credit system and all the rest of it. So China's on the way to building its digital control system. So whoever gets there first, the kind of inertia of that from a trade perspective will tip everyone else in. So people kind of miss what the goal is from this level, right? So that's what I mean. Like I knew the when because it's obvious. It's not even like you need to be especially good at the tarot to work out that, like all countries, like all empires, America's on the decline. It doesn't mean it's going to end up like Cormac McCarthy's The Road. It doesn't mean the country collapses, just like Britain did in the 20th century. It's on the way down, and there's another one on the way up, right? And it would be great if we could do that without going to war, but I don't think that's. But yeah, it's a long time. This is going to be a long decade, right? It's only the beginning of 2022.
Right. Well, it is sort of, sobering a little bit to hear the inevitability of it, the way you put it, because
Sure.
I think that is something that stresses me out, to say the least, but also a little worries me a little bit, because I see a lot of people in our community, that care about truth and having open discourse about this stuff, get into this, fear-stricken state where, the world is collapsing and, China's going to do this and we're all going to, be in a matrix slave state. So we're
not doing it gracefully, right? Like it's as simple as that. We're doing it with all the grace of Britney Spears falling out of a car. Like it's just, and that's because particularly, although this country is disappointing in its own way. I mean, Australia, if people haven't worked out from the accent, you guys have not been. The brainwashing you guys got growing up in the United States has this kind of like capitalist eternalism and national superiority and kind of like cosmic American mission. And now that it's becoming clear that was always crap, that was always advertising copy. People have to do two things at once, which is to get their head around collapse or transition whilst at the same time transitioning. So there's a lot, and yes, China's going to do this. China's going to invade the boomer terror is disappointing in the conspiracy world. It should stay on Facebook where it's written in all caps by my parents' friends, right? Like it's the xenophobia. It's not that it isn't a dictatorial, communist regime. It really is. That's not the point. The point is kind of people are sort of vomiting their shadow. China's behind all of this. China's doing all these things. It's not. Were it so clean cut, that would be great, but it isn't. And also, this is a real good thing about frameworks like astrology or magic in general, is the tremendous medicine, something like astrology, is this too shall pass, right? So it sucks right now, but this will pass. But along with that is, I don't want to say like, this is a weird way of saying America too shall pass, but like the role that the United States has in the world and the way it sees itself is going to pass, because it always does. Like the United States at the beginning of the 20th century was anti-interventionist and wanted to leave, and rightly so, wanted to leave the rest of the world, particularly Europe, to its dumb little colonial wars. And it took a lot to get the United States to be this sort of militant expansionist thing that it became in the 20th century, because that's what suited the banking powers like the Rockefellers and so on. And we're in a bit. The kind of American psyche's natural state is one of isolationism. It's just there's been this 100-year maniacal invasion of everywhere else in the world. And so there's good news coming too, right? We're just like, well, God, we don't have to do that anymore. That'd be great. That's one of the things that was one of the interesting things looking over the second half of the 20th century as Britain packed out its empire was, culturally speaking, a rediscovery of Britishness and Englishness and Scottishness and so on. If you think of the Sex Pistols and kind of like swinging 60s and all the rest of it, all of that stuff happened as part of a okay, well, we're not the British Empire anymore. What are we then? That sort of reconfiguration of what it meant to be British or English or Scottish or what have you. So there's good news. There's good news coming in America's inevitable retirement from being like the global sheriff. So if people are concerned about it, just think about, well, hang on, what do we want to be then? Because it's happening anyway.
I like that. Yeah, that's the optimism that I hope people will find on the show. And, I think that's the optimism I have that makes me feel a little naive sometimes, because I don't focus on the current events on this show, and I really don't focus on it in my daily life. I've done a lot to de-stress my world by doing that, and finding content like the one, I'll say, like what we can find on RuneSoup and other great podcasts have helped me see the world for what it actually is, rather than what, the drumbeat of the media is constantly telling us it is. So,
agreed. So one of the best things people can do is just avoid all of that nonsense. Like, honestly, I'm trying to do my best. 2020, I kind of ran like a newsroom for members because there was enough experience I had with, I used to work in media and so on. So I'm like, cool, I'm gonna surface what I can find. And I was doing that all day, every day to help people navigate or kind of like situate a framework. But from a lot of last year, the less you can focus on it, the better. Because why are you stressing your amygdala, and why are you causing like actual physical damage to yourself by listening to, I don't know, mainstream news when you don't? It's wrong. You don't need to. You're actually going to get dumber and get less healthy.
Right.
So it's a good move, Mark. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, and it leads me into something that we've been talking about on the show a lot, and I know you are very familiar with this because of the new book coming out, but the landscape itself seems to be calling to me. I think, a friend of mine, Michael Wan, who I do a show with weekly, really inspired me to look into my own backyard after everything he found in the Susquehanna River Valley. And that in itself has led to so much, A, synchronicities, but B, actual, I don't want to say discoveries, because this information was already out there, but personally it was a discovery, looking into my own history, where I'm from. And I think there's something that podcasting in particular offers people. And I try to do it with that show with Mike, where we show people, hey, there are things exciting for you to find in your own life, in your own backyard, when you open yourself up to it with this sort of what we've been calling it a synchro-mystic awareness. But really, I don't think that's all that different than what you were describing earlier with this sort of, take at, animism. And it's not, it's not all that different. I mean, the stone structures, the, energies of the land, they're literally seeping out and calling to over the past few years. And I've taken a journey into it now, actually taken the invite.
Good. You're coming back into right relation. That's what's happening. That's the other good news of this process. The technocratic hijack, for the most part, fails because it doesn't work. Like the cosmology is wrong. And I know Chris Knowles, you mentioned him before. A lot of that stuff he says about these people have these stupid mid-20th century scientific ideas that they're going to have like Jetsons cars and shit. The people running the world, like that, those things, they don't work because they're built in a framework of materialism that is itself wrong. So that's a big part of with the injections. One of the reasons, like, they don't work. That's just as simple as that. They don't work because that's not how human biology or biology at all works, right? So coming back to what you were saying, the technocratic hijack is going to kind of take care of itself in the sense of it's going to fail. We're still going to be stuck in this kind of, for however long, silly, check-in, demented surveillance tyranny. They're going to keep trying, but it's not going to work. But what's happening in the meantime, and it's what the arrival of the technocratic hijack has forced upon those people who are kind of ready to wake up, is a return to right relation. So everyone else is like, well, this is all gross. This kind of like, this you will own nothing and be happy, great reset technocracy is awful. It tastes bad in my mouth. Like, this is just like evil, right? And it's the presence of that has cause people to go, well, what is about me? What are the beings in which I'm in relation with like? What are the hills? What are the trees? And that's really good. I hope, and I don't think we go back to it, not that we ever go back to anything kind of normal, right? I just mentioned this, the decade has the trajectory that it has. But I hope that doesn't go away. I hope more and more people like yourself, Mark, re-enchant and come back into right relation with where they are. I think that's wonderful. That is animism. That's great.
Thank you. Well, to go into that a little further, what are some practices that you might recommend to myself or the listeners? I mean, we kind of touched on cunning folk a little bit, but we haven't really given it a fair shake. Can we go into that any further, and how, I mean, other than, herbology and understanding plant medicine, which I'm sure there's a lot to say about that. Is there anything else?
Well, that's kind of like two questions. There's things everyone can do, and there's a discussion of the cunning tradition, right? So actually one of the courses in the members area is on magical geography, and there are techniques in there that allow people to kind of like rediscover what Schuyler de Lubitsch called the intelligence of the heart, which is the mode of communication with the more than human world is principally heart-centered. And so people, one of the first things you want to do is sit with what I said about it. It's an arbitrary definition that we've just made humans the only persons on the planet. When you realize that's true, there's no reason for that. Why isn't a tree a person? Then go for a walk in the woods. Go for a walk in the woods and see them as beings. Don't see them as trees. See them as beings that will very likely outlast you. That's even better. So there are trees on my property. I live in a little farm in southern Tasmania that predate Federation. So that was 1901 for Australia. Not many. There's like one tree that does, fair enough. And there are other ones that will hopefully outlast me, including ones that I'm planting, like heritage apple trees and so on. But like, walk through the more than human world with the understanding that they are beings. And that doesn't mean that, like I said, it doesn't mean you can talk to them about what you're watching on Netflix. But they are beings that share the cosmos with you at this point in time. That's the bit that we don't get. Like, we're both here right now, this tree and you, we're both here right now. That makes us, and this is a real indigenous idea, that makes us some kind of relatives, because here we are at this moment in the physical world, like sharing like chunks of time. And there are trees that haven't, and there are trees that will come, just as there are humans and not. But if you are here in the cosmos right now with these beings, this is your community of beings, right? And so there's nothing spooky about doing that as you go in the walks, right? Like, just to see that these trees and shrubs and rivers are beings. And that's definitional. You're not saying anything woo by doing it. You're just kind of like reclaiming from too narrow a definition what things like personhood is. So that's the beginning, because you do that and you do that a number of times, and the rest of it is like pushing on an open door. The rest of it is like, okay, well, it's going to be much easier then to move into an intelligence of the heart based method of communication. And that, again, is a birthright thing. Humans should be able to do that. And the trick is, like a plant doesn't have a brain, right? It doesn't have that structure. It doesn't have a mouth. And so the thoughts that co-arise when you fill your awareness with a particular plant, the thoughts that co-arise as that happens is a mode of communication from the tree, right? Or the plant or the what have you. And you can actually, there's some very famous for herbalists like Stephen Howard Buhner. For decades, he's been doing workshops with people, and he'll give them plants. And they like, try this technique. And everyone's like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do it. So just sit there, fill the plant with your awareness, just like let it just, and the way I do it is to basically think that the plant or tree or whatever that I'm about to come into a relationship with is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Like a parent to a child, just look at it and marvel, which is easy because I like plants, but like marvel at the shape and the color and what have you, and just see what happens. And what would happen with these workshop attendees, you give them the plants and they'd be like, I think this one's really happy. And this one's, they'll start giving their descriptions back to Stephen. And he's like, and 2/3 of the time, or if not a bit more, the personality they get back from the plant aligns with the traditional herbal associations of if it's happiness or maternal or what have you. So there's something to, and that really helps people go, oh, wow, there's definitely something to this, because there is. Like, this comes back to, this is what humans are, right? This is, we're in the universe at the same time as these beings, and we have that method of communication. We just told ourselves in the West a few centuries ago that we didn't, and we must have looked truly insane. Well, I mean, we were insane, but we must have looked truly insane as Europeans getting in our little wooden boats and heading out into the world to people who are actually, who never lost that method of communication. And what the hell is wrong with it? Like, I live in Tasmania, and there are people who, which was, and to some extent still is, a prison. So, you know, famous prison breaks of convicts getting out of wherever, and they die in the bush, in the wilderness here, of starvation. And if you think, the native Tasmanians looking at these people dying of starvation in what is effectively an aisle of their supermarket, it's just really dumb. Like, that's a dumb thing to have happen, right? Because they died surrounded by plants that they had no idea were edible, or no ways of understanding how to, like, which animals they could capture and how. And that, so our version of that now as a recovery thing is do the walk through the trees and understand them as beings, right? So that's the first thing. The cunning tradition thing, the word is really important. The word comes from how I use the word. So cunning folk are people who have, in a European context, fulfilled that role of mediator and healer since forever, right? So, and inside that, and the reason the word is used historically is because the word witch is bad. And I think that's a fair, I have a problem with, not that I have a problem with modern witchcraft, but I have a problem with modern witchcraft claiming the word witch is wholly benign. It's not. And in the rest of the world, it isn't. But also in a historical context or a European context, a witch is a pejorative. You could call someone a witch and then, you know, burn her, right? But the cunning folk were what people who think witchcraft is benign actually are doing, right? And it's the right framework to sit with if you are involved in magic in the 21st century, because one of the things we need to clean on our journey is to come back into right relation with Christianity. And that's not the sort of 20th century dismissal of it as, again, like I just kind of mentioned, most of the things people dislike about it were inherited, cosmologically dislike about it. Historically, there is much to critique, but typically cunning folk would have familiars, they would have saints that they would work with, or angels, or so on. And it would be in this framework and with these beings that they would be administering healing and so on, right? And that's a specialist, like, it's good for people to know that that's in our kind of like cultural lineage, I guess, but it doesn't necessarily mean you need to toddle off and become a cunning woman, right? That's not exactly it, but that's what the tradition is. And we've kind of, the 20th century has misused the word witchcraft for many good reasons, but the reality is it's, in a European historical context especially, that was like a bad word. And also from a Fortean perspective, right, or even a cryptid perspective, witch has to do a lot of heavy lifting as a word. And this is where I think people who are trying to claim it as female empowerment, it's not that you can't do that, but that it's not the whole, the use of the word doesn't begin and end there, right? Because if you look at stories of like ufology through history, stuff like cattle mutilations would happen in places like Italy and Austria, and they would be just ascribed to witches who would come at night and sort of take all the blood out of the cattle and kind of cut them in ritualistic ways. So they knew that these were some kind of like demonic or evil beings, right? And so witch is used in that sense. And like the quote unquote shaman at Skinwalker Ranch, that's not a human being, right? But, and so we can't say all shamans are mediators in the same way we can't say all witches are feminist icons. It's the term has to do more heavy lifting if we're going to start doing cross-cultural co-understanding better. Doesn't mean you can't use it. It just means you don't have exclusive access to it. And that's why the sort of recentering of the cunning traditions, which is what's happening magically over the last few years, I think is quite important, because it gives people the intellectual room to kind of situate themselves in what it is they're drawn to.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's definitely helpful to remove all that historical baggage, for sure. I think that's why a lot of people, as you put, are a little turned off by the whole Christian thing. And it's funny, to take it back to what you're talking about, counterculture. It seems to me like there are sort of two roots of conspiratorial thinking, and it comes from the apocalyptic Christian
Absolutely.
and then the counterculture sort of lone wolf type rugged figure. And I try to gravitate towards the latter, but there's a lot of
Yeah.
there's a lot of that cosmological mysticism that does get me interested. I don't wholly write off what the Christians are saying, but I just try to take it with a big, big grain of salt because it's mixed in with that, we're all doomed.
Yeah, no, it's worth pointing. One, I don't consider that Christianity. I consider that churchianity. But you're absolutely right that the conspiracy world has two lineages, and one of them is the people who grew up in these really awful, kind of like gross mega church worlds, and rightly so fell out of it. But that framework is still there. That kind of like terrifying apocalypse is upon us, satanic pedophile framework. They still have that as a cosmology. Now that's actually not Christianity. That's kind of my point. That's churchianity, and that if you come back into right relation with Christianity, you can see that. You can see that Christianity is local saint festivals in southern France and that kind of stuff, right? It's not mega churches attached to the CIA that have their own TV stations. That's not it's not what it is. But I agree completely, and it's absolutely right that I'm glad that more people can see that those are the two lineages in conspiracy land, and people, you can tell the people who haven't done the work of moving past that in their childhood, if they're a little bit too, it's funny, Alex Jones is only mostly like this, but are a little bit too like dominionist about it, and they'll get there eventually. You can usually tell by their opinion of someone like Terence McKenna. Like you kind of go, what do you think of Terence McKenna? It's like CIA and here to debase the culture, and you go, great, so I'll put you in this category. You are this kind of conspiracist. Yeah, I think I agree completely. Yeah.
Well, and that kind of brings me towards a question I had about chaos magic. And we already kind of dispelled a lot of that illusion. But I remember, in this time, post dropping out of college, becoming fascinated with a lot of these books that had this material in it. I ran across a peer who said that they were practicing chaos magic. And even, with my sort of amateurish understanding of the occult, I was pretty disturbed. I'm like, this guy's doing chaos magic. I don't want to get wrapped up in that. But I think even that has a lot of that baggage that, your
Sure.
book really shows how the economy's chaotic already. This is kind of like the structure through which we can thrive. Am I paraphrasing off what you would say? Do you agree with that?
So the guys who invented it or came up with it, in particular Peter J. Carroll, a British guy in the 80s, living in squats in Stoke Newington in London, and then sort of in the back of a bookstore up in the north of England. Peter says that he named it in the 80s, there was a very popular chaos mathematics book by James Gleick called Chaos. And if you kind of remember Jurassic Park and all the rest of it has this whole like chaos math thing, it was a big 80s vibe, right? Fractals and Mandelbrot sets and all that kind of stuff. So when Peter came up with the term, it was based on chaos mathematics. So that kind of idea of predictability and interconnectedness. And it's quite a good way of thinking about magic. The whole butterfly flaps its wings in Tokyo, rainstorms in San Francisco idea is actually a good way of thinking about magic, right? So it comes from that sort of idea of thinking with complex systems is why it's called chaos magic. That's the 80s version. Hits the 90s, and Peter's books are kind of bundled up and sold, particularly in the US by Wiser. And then the rise of the internet, the 90s internet made it, and the 90s had Buffy and the Matrix and all the rest of it. So it kind of gave itself in America a spooky vibe that wasn't necessarily there as a kind of like anything goes version of it, which also isn't quite right. Like, so chaos magic, as Peter conceived it, was rigorous, so that you could look at a solar ritual and go, well, is this going to work as well with Apollo if I like with Superman as with Apollo, right? So sort of like split testing rituals to find the parts of a ceremony that actually like quote unquote work. Now there are problems with that as a cosmology, but that's what he was doing. And the spoiler is that actually it'll work with Superman, but it works better with Apollo. And that's the bit that kind of got missed in the 90s. And so it got all this kind of like ooky spooky vibes attached to it, particularly as it started to associate itself more and more with like Necronomicon stuff and so on, which is fine. Like I've got a bunch of different versions of the Necronomicon, and I certainly fucked around with that extensively as a teenager and what have you. So it sounds scarier than it is because people forget that like chaos was like a cooler word in the 80s. And then obviously because of that, and because it sort of lost some of the fidelity or edge to it coming into the 2016 election and all the rest of it, people just use that to be almost like in a good sense, ontological terrorism. So, and that used to be like a traditional hippie freak out, if you remember the Simpsons episode, and all the kind of like counterculture stuff around Robert Anton Wilson was all about doing things that disrupt culture, particularly with joy, but doing things that disrupt culture, which is this kind of like oppressive framework. And so that term, when you move that into like Reddit and the Chans, heading into 2016, it started to be associated with like pro-Trump shit posting and all the rest of it. Again, none of that's in there, right? Like that's almost like the term witch. Chaos magic, I can call it what it is as a chaos magician, but I actually don't own the full reach of the term. And so the people who are talking about, Pepe memesters being chaos magicians, you can use that term if you want. That's not like, that's not chaos magic if you're doing it in a ceremonial or a serious context, I guess. So that's the story of the term. Now what it means, I've got another book, like an ebook called Pieces of Eight, which is kind of like essays on chaos magic. And it's essentially an attitude that you adopt to the practice of magic where you don't let yourself off the hook for failures, right? So if you want to experiment. If it doesn't work, be honest with yourself and either go back to the ones that do work, or this is how you build and innovate. So that's my chaos magic, I guess, is the way of saying it. That's what it is. And that's kind of like a potted history of the term. And the chaos magic I do has nothing to do with, and most people, has nothing to do with Pepe memesters in late 2015 and 2016.
Well,
for instance, yeah.
I like that. And I want to maybe ask you to elaborate a little bit more on not letting yourself go when it comes to failures. I may be paraphrasing there, but I think that's extremely important. I don't know if we're taking it the same way. That's why I'd like you to elaborate. I think it's important that you take your failures and you don't let those crush you or let your failures become your identity. I think that's maybe what you would agree with. Can you elaborate?
I mean, I would. So failure in a chaos magic context is very specific. It's like experimental failure. So what you can't do is let yourself off the hook if an enchantment doesn't work. So you perform an enchantment to get a job, you didn't get the job, it didn't work. Because what will typically happen in the magical world, and the trouble is, it's not that this isn't true, and that's kind of the next point I'm going to make. What will typically happen in the magical world is you'll do an enchantment for getting a job, you don't get the job, and you'll justify to yourself why it didn't work. Like it either wasn't meant to be, or I guess my spirits had something else in store for me, and so on, rather than saying like, or I just didn't do that because I experimented, I didn't do that enchantment particularly well. Like it just didn't work. Maybe you could do the why it didn't work, but you certainly can do, I'm going to try it differently next time, right? So it's a very specific, like scientific experimental understanding of failure, which is you're not allowed to let yourself off the hook. And the funny thing is, even if your failure isn't the reason, your failure in enchantment isn't the reason why you didn't get the job, because actually most of the time, if not all the time, the universe does kind of have its way of working things out. So it probably is the case that if you didn't get that job, it wasn't, however you want to phrase this, meant to be. So it's probably still a true statement, but it's not a statement you can use to let yourself off the hook for improving at magic. And so that's what I mean. Like failure is as a kind of like a more bigger metaphysical idea is its own thing. But specifically, that's the difference. If you're doing that with your magic, you're doing chaos magic. If you're like not letting yourself off the hook if it didn't work, and not just explaining it away, because you don't get better at that point. Even if that's true, you don't get better at it. And there's a whole bunch of techniques that have come out of chaos magic that are now in like the wider magical culture and even culture in general that emerged from that mindset. Now, that's not a mindset to take to everything in your life. I would even say you should probably restrict it just to something like that, because there are healthier and more beneficial understandings of failure, which you just articulated, Mark. But very specifically, it's if your enchantment doesn't work, that's what happened. You didn't do a successful enchantment, and it's quite stark and overly harsh, but that's just the technique.
Right. Now, I'm wondering if we can connect this back to shamanism, because I think a lot of people misconstrue shamanism as, a bunch of drunk, high, basically intoxicated sorcerers, and I think that's like what we've, got at these EDM festivals, maybe the result of some of that culture. But I don't think that that's necessarily at all what shamanism was initially about. I mean, those substances were used ritualistically at certain times. They certainly weren't smoking weed every day like I am. So I'm wondering, in terms of plant and the plant world, how do we start to have a right relation with the plants we're using? I mean, coffee, tobacco, all of these sorts of, intoxicating plants that are in our daily life. How do we begin to have a right relationship with those things? Because I think they definitely lend their help in a lot of ways, but they can also lead to a lot of chaos, unfortunately.
And that's always on our side, right? Tobacco is the perfect example. And I say this as an ex-smoker. Like tobacco, let's say mapacho, which is the name of the being in the Amazon. That's like the wild tobacco. And so we have, by the time it ends up in your Marlboro Light, it's a very different organism and covered in all kinds of chemicals and what have you, right? But mapacho as a being is one of the principal plant teachers in the Amazon. And it's a protective being. And so you don't go into ceremony with something like ayahuasca without other beings like mapacho. So if you are, and again, no judgment, but let's stick with tobacco, then we'll move to the ones that I like better. If that is you, think about are you doing that? Are you hand rolling your mapacho in the Amazon, or are you like inhaling a plant that is essentially, or a plant being that is imprisoned inside this demented capitalist machine? You're inhaling it in 2 puffs as you're running to the train station or something on your way to work. That used to be me, right? Are you in right relation? Like, how is this being? Touch base with the tobacco being in a Marlboro Light and think, is it happy? And that was actually part of my process of moving out of no longer smoking at all, was like, okay, I'm going to switch this up to American Spirit and like organic hand-rolled stuff, which is definitely better. And then in the end, like, I can't do that relation. Like I had, 15 years of smoking, that was enough. So that's one of them. The big part of it is to know its story. And the same thing with coffee. Coffee is, in fact, easier now. You obviously have to pay more, but that's what happens. It's easier now to make ethical choices as much as possible with a being like that. I would also say you need to know the beginnings and ending of its relationship. So I've had one caffeinated coffee in the last 6 weeks. I love coffee. Like I would drink it every day. And I have some decaf if I need it for like health reasons. But I'm kind of like playing in and out with caffeine and addiction and so on. And when I do have a quote unquote normal coffee, it's almost psychedelic, like it's magnificent, right? And so it's not necessarily just moderation, because you might have like my ayahuasquera down here, her principal plant being is mapacho. And it's funny, she got kicked out of her Airbnb when she was traveling earlier because she listed, am I a smoker? And she's like, no, I'm not a smoker. But like, she's an ayahuasquera who runs ayahuasca ceremonies. So all her stuff smells of quote unquote tobacco, because it's got, tobacco in her bags and all the rest of it. And she got kicked out because the owner of the Airbnb is like, you said you weren't a smoker. She's like, I'm not. She's like, the whole place thinks, I said, oh, right. So there's a way of recognizing it as a being and its story. And the same thing with marijuana, right? Marijuana is a separate category to it's further along on a different journey. So marijuana is a spirit on a mission. And I used to use that term for ayahuasca, and I still do, which is to say it has recognized that it has urgent medicine for these times. And a similar thing is happening with psilocybin. And so it's finding more people, it's reorganizing the legal structure around itself and allowing it to move into the role it had 6,500 years ago when we find, cannabis seeds in the pouches of people who've been buried in big covered burials in Eurasia. So it's moving back into a healing function, right? Now, that doesn't mean like anything else, like tobacco and the rest of it, that doesn't mean smoke as much as you want, but it does mean that spirit's on a mission. It'll probably walk over you to like complete that mission. So that's what I mean. Like, say, what being am I with right now? And if it's cannabis, it's like, okay, cool. Why am I with this? And is it in a medicinal capacity? Like, I would never take ayahuasca recreationally. It's a struggle to take it recreationally, but like, I would never do that outside of a ceremonial context. Now, the ceremony associated with cannabis is lighter because we're having to invent them or rediscover them now. Or ayahuasca has a set collection of praxis. So it's the same thing. Like, once you realize that this is a being, like, how am I in relation with this? And is this a pathological relationship? What am I giving back to it? How is this working for me? Because that's the other part of it. Like, you kind of got to close the relationality loop of what am I giving back to here? So my ayahuasquero in Peru is participating in a bunch of different like chacruna plantations. So like growing the chacruna plant and experimenting, because this is more difficult to do, with growing the capi vine, because with the explosion of the popularity of ayahuasca, and he's very particular about which plant beings he selects. Used to be, when he first started out, he'd only have to go half a day into the jungle to get what he wanted. Now it's like 3 days there and back to find the material he needs for the ceremonies. So how are we doing that? Like, the whole story, once you take it seriously as a being, as a person, makes it different for every person, but that's universal. Like, know the being story, know it as a being, and then like, how are you in relation to it is almost like the 3 steps of answering your question.
Well, I love that, because it's really, I mean, giving me, I will say, flashbacks, no pun intended, because I remember smoking cannabis for the first time out of a pipe in a tree house that my father and I built, right? Like, really like opening my whole mind up. And I can't leave out tobacco, because that was a big part of it. Where I live, kids would smoke blunts, right? So that was sort of inextricable. So I kind of got to know Mapacho in a really awfully, condensed, sort of misconstrued way. And cannabis. And, as you were saying that, I'm like, wow, I wonder how much of my life has been guided by this. And when you said the phrase, it'll walk right over you, I'm like, well, yeah, I definitely have experienced that for sure. But then there's also this somewhat of a glimpse of that I'm learning something, and there's a glimpse of that I'm on the right track, and there's a glimpse of like, oh, maybe I should stick with this. Now, I'm so glad
lean into it, like, just to follow that up, right? So for people who, and it's funny, like, the word recreational isn't quite right. So I enjoy taking psilocybin mushrooms. I use them in a ceremonial context, and so I'll do the journeying with them. But because the high lasts 4 hours, whatever, 5 hours, the journey stuff, so it takes about an hour to come up. It's about an hour or so of journeying and insight. And then I'm kind of like pleasantly high for a couple of hours, right? And I've actually got a solo show called How and Why to Take Mushrooms that explains the whole praxis. Because I lay in, seasonal fruits, and like we do the local organic yogurt here and all this kind of stuff. Because when you're with the mushroom, everything tastes like real things taste incredible. If you try to eat artificial things, it's not pleasant, right? But so there's this real enjoyment part that comes at the end of it. So similarly for people who are quote unquote recreationally with cannabis, just spend a moment before you spark up, or however you're doing it, to set an intention of, what am I doing? Like, this is the wrong intention. It's like, oh, I had a fucked day at work. I'm just going to throw myself on the couch and get high. It's like, rephrase that, reorganize that, and set an intention to be with cannabis in its healing capacity and any insight it may have to live a less stressful life or what have you. So that's important, like to bring the intentionality to it. Shamanism is basically intentionality. And so I just wanted to jump in there for people who are regularly using it. I think people have a love for it, and they might have a little ritual around, grinding and how they actually do it, which is good. But set an intention, like this is a being, and if you're coming to it for healing, say that, right? Like, and if you're coming to it for insight, say that. Lean into what it is you would hope to get out of that relation. And yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that you clarified that, because I guess what I was trying to get at is sort of based on what you were saying about the ceremonial use of ayahuasca. Really strangely enough, this one person on YouTube comments on every video, and they heard me talk about this, and they keep telling me, you have to do DMT. So I'm like, as you're saying that, I'm like, is the DMT spirit working through this person whose screen name is 3III? Like, because like, shout out to you out there, whoever that is.
DMT isn't ayahuasca, right? Like ayahuasca is a certain being.
Right.
So I actually view DMT as a human technology in the same way I view LSD. It's weird. LSD, it is a person. It might not be a spirit. And animists can make that distinction. It's annoying, but it kind of works, right? Because lysergic acid and say Hawaiian baby woodrose beings, but LSD is something humans make, right? And in the same way, DMT is, if we don't make it, we extract and isolate it, right? So there's other things going on in it, which means it's a technology that gets you into a different reality. And so in that sense, that's how I would, because I agree. I think take the damn DMT. It's an interesting experience, but you're not doing ayahuasca, right? So you sort of let off the hook of, if someone had sent you like an old milk bottle filled with some ayahuasca that they brought back from Iquitos, I would probably not. I would probably say, if it were me, I wouldn't do that. But DMT in a pen is a human technology, and it's a human technology that will grant you access to another reality. And so that's how I would come into relation with that. So I agree with this commenter then. I think you should take it. You should take it in that context.
Right on. All right. Well, thank you for clarifying that. And then I guess, you kind of answered my other question that I had, because I was wondering if the ayahuasca being and the cannabis being might be in conflict, because I've heard stories of, I think it was Rupert Sheldrake who said that he was like a frequent cannabis user and he couldn't quit. And then he had an ayahuasca experience and he stopped smoking cannabis. It might have been Graham Hancock now that I think about it, but yeah. So
Rupert Sheldrake's amazing. He has done ayahuasca, and I presume he's done marijuana, but yeah.
Okay. So different British gentleman.
Yes. Yeah. Graham Hancock was he admits this, like pathologically addicted to it, and he needed it to write and so on. And about a decade ago now, I think he's back. I think last time he was on Rogan, he smoked weed for the first time in 5 years. So he's probably back on it. But yeah, he went to the jungle and did a dieta and kind of ended that relationship. He got into trouble for it because he called the article "Breaking Up with the Green Bitch." And there's all these, which is fair. That a lot of people who are pro marijuana are like, that's kind of a harsh thing to say. He's like, you're right. I meant that my relationship to it was pathological. It's certainly not. I didn't mean anything negatively towards cannabis herself. But yeah, I don't know if they're in conflict, but ayahuasca is a cosmic healer. And so she will heal what you bring to her to heal. And Graham brought his addiction to marijuana to be healed.
Right. I love that. I wanted to go back to the chaos protocol. I think this is something that a lot of people, again, you alluded to, they think there's one single cabal that runs the world, and if we could only point the finger at them, the whole world will be saved. But I don't really see it that way. And what's funny is, as I was reading your your book about the fractional reserve banking and how you're describing the ins and outs and how it works. I'm like, this sounds just like this guy, Let's Go Finance, who was telling me on the phone this morning that I should be using this new crypto app and people would, place their money in my stake in my podcast, and then they could take it out whenever they want. I'm like, well, I'm not a bank, I'm a podcast. So it was just interesting to see how these same tricks are being rebranded now in the crypto space.
Yeah, they're well, it's a spell, so it works, and we're at a point, and it's going to take a generation to work out. Like I'm opposed to central bank digital currencies, but I'm not opposed to digital currencies. There's tremendous arguments for them, right? I'm generally opposed to any form of centralizing, but that is, it's a spell. It's a really good way, and it's in the right hands. Well, in everyone's hands rather than in the right hands. It's quite powerful. Like so there are things that have happened with the sort of central bank era in terms of wealth creation. So everyone, the entire Western world, and in fact, the entire world just has got richer, just at different speeds, right? And unfortunately, in the middle of it, with a handful of billionaires, it's stratospheric and monstrous, right? But as a spell, as a prosperity spell, there's been some good associated with it. So the idea of like having an elastic money supply that can expand and whatever is a generally good idea. But coming back to the single cabal thing, people want it to be that, particularly in the people who've tumbled out of the mega church and ended up in conspiracy, want it to be a single, maybe satanic, maybe not, cabal of people running the world. And more importantly, that if you can, there's a telos to that, which you just kind of mentioned. Like if you can just point them out, if you can just like arrest Bill Gates, then everything will be fine. And that's the same thing. People generally, I had a friend of a friend who went down the 9/11 rabbit hole when I was still in London, so sort of about 8 years ago, and basically lost his whole life to it, because very often people do with their first like conspiracy, right? They lost his whole life to it. And our mutual friend was kind of having it out with him, almost like an intervention, like, fine, 9/11 was a whatever you want to call it. What do you do with that information? What, like, because you're just ruining your life with it. Are you going to solve it and then march on Washington? Like, what's going to happen? And that's the other side of, once you find the bad guy, it comes with an unhealthy telos. It comes with an unhealthy to-do list. It's like, all we need to do is arrest Bill Gates and it'll be fine. It's not how the universe works, but it's not how you're in relation to it. So for me, understanding the machinations of power is really important for me to build my own map, rather than some kind of naive justice quest, because it won't ever work. Like, I remember at the beginning of this whole pandemic nonsense, John Rappaport made the point that we're in a 10,000-year war. This isn't like a new thing. And that's absolutely the right way of thinking about it. I don't really use war metaphors much anymore, but it's the right way of thinking about it, which is that this is a single front or a single theater in a much, much longer war or interaction or journey, with in between, flourishing and control, however you want to call that. We can use cosmic beings, we can talk about archons, we can do whatever. But I think the other side of conspiracy land kind of gets there closer, or gets there faster, gets to the idea of like, well, what is the point of knowing all this stuff, or even the stuff, because we don't know as much as we think we do, but like, what is the point of even pursuing this sort of understanding? And that's a really important question. That's really important, right? And it comes back to having that wider awareness so that you can make plans for yourself, whether you want to, which I don't think is a very good idea, get your podcast tangled up with some new like crypto approach. But you kind of know that if you have that wider context. It's not that you personally, Mark, are going to go and end the Fed or something. That's the bit that people need to kind of know where they are in relation to the rest of the universe. Because otherwise it's just, you're playing out your psychological drama. You're getting angry at daddy for locking you in your room when you were 5, still as an adult, right? And it's really challenging at the moment, because the machinations of power are like materially impacting and threatening your health. So I get it. But again, the solution, if you, the universe, like coming back to Bill Gates is a good example, right? Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, the rest of them, the whole lot. If it wasn't them, it would have been someone else at this point in time. And so it's not the right way of being with this challenge to kind of like hope for the arrest of whoever. It's because it would have been someone else, because this is what happens now. And that's that kind of like magical or metaphysical approach to it, I suppose.
Indeed. Yeah, I think that the phrase Philip K. Dick used, the black iron prison, if you could see the bars, you can touch it, you can recognize you're in a prison. When I read that in your book, it reminded me of a song by Jedi Mind Tricks, Vinny Paz. And he uses a David Icke quote where he says just that. But it's so interesting how these pieces of culture echo, you know, many years before what's happening now. And I wonder, you know, what there is to say about that in the kind of reality nexus point where we're at. You know, do you subscribe to the thought that, you know, we're kind of, I mean, it's almost like what you were saying with the chaos magic, but that we're at this nexus point of interchangeable realities, and our choice can determine whether in a dystopian future or a great utopia?
I mean, on the one hand, every point in space-time is that point. But on the other hand, no, in the sense that it's important to be optimistic, but it's also important to be realistic. So, and this comes back to that whole interventionism thing. If people kind of hoping that you can somehow correct this ship, somehow like, okay, well, we got to get out of this. We've all got to get out of this. And it's just not what happens. There are too many people, like the Matthias Desmet stuff, 30% of the people are gone, completely brainwashed, right? There's 40% in play, but there are going to be people in your lifetime who will still be wearing masks. Like when you retire from whatever it is you do, it's so be optimistic, but channel the optimism into local and hyperlocal and like almost like hyperdimensionally connected local situations is a good example. But it doesn't, the trouble with the nexus point idea is that it's almost like that. It's almost like it's the second coming of Jesus. It's still got that echo of being saved. It's still got like the whole, okay, well, we can all do this now. And I don't think that happens. So if you've got pinned all your hopes on that and you're not scenario planning other options, you only have yourself to blame. Now, it's again important to be optimistic, but I just think if we woke up tomorrow and the whole pandemic narrative was over, the inertia from the damage that's already been caused is enough to kind of unspool the rest of this decade the way I was talking anyway, right? Like we just suddenly wake up and say, ding, no one has to take any injections, no masks. There are plenty of treatments for this kind of stuff. No more check-ins, no more surveillance, no more any of that. The damage that's been done to, you know, the food supply next year and all the rest of it, we still have to account for. So I don't think we're at a nexus point where we can all move into or change reality and all be in this new bright future. But we are at a moment, I call it I learned it in shaman school, but I call it the Pachacuti. We are in a moment where the people who need to find each other and wake up are in the process of doing so. So we're sort of like the new civilization that's being built. Not everyone lives in it, even though we all live in the same place. And so I'm optimistic about that. I'm optimistic there are millions and millions of people who probably would have gone along with, because let's be clear, even before the pandemic narrative, it's not like the way we lived was great. It's not like we were doing the right thing when it comes to the earth and nutrition and you know, equitable resources for everyone, all the rest of it. So it's not like things were good before this whole nonsense happened. But I don't think the people who woke up over the last 2 years are ever going back to sleep. So we kind of live in that mycelial connected, hyperdimensional connected network of local communities of awake people. I'm really optimistic about that. I don't necessarily think we are at a nexus point where we end up with a physical beaming utopia, if you will.
Yeah, I want to go back to something you talked about with Beijing, right? Because as you described that trajectory of world power, it just fit right in with, again, friend Michael Wan and Ross Ben and what they've been talking about with the 40th parallel, right? So I'm sure you're aware Beijing is on the 40th parallel, Philadelphia is on the 40th, New York City, and a lot of major places that empires have been built on, as you put. I wonder, less specific to the 40th parallel, have you looked into ley line, telluric energy currents, and what do you think the value of them on that same vein of like hyper connected local, fix your local area first? I mean, how do they play into that soup?
I wouldn't use a ley line framework as a single geopolitical predictive framework. I like cycle models better. That being said, coming back to like a local level, if you think about again, ley lines are a culture specific way of describing a true thing. So obviously let's just make it easy and say it's a British idea that there are channels of energy that connect different points in a landscape, right? Let's just call it that. And why you have to call it that is when you say it's a culture-specific way of describing something true, then all of a sudden you can put it in relation to feng shui and other kind of like Chinese or international landscape metaphysics, right? And what is a landscape metaphysics but a language of understanding like the power and personality of a place. And so in that sense, I think it's critical for particularly like living in a local or for your local community to do so. Like I'm maybe a special case, but our little permaculture farm here has a bunch of different magic and ceremonial stuff associated with it and things that are corrected from an astrological perspective buried in different places and so on. And that's being in relation to like country and sky country down here. So it's not ley lines explicitly. You can use ley lines if you vibe with them, because what you're doing there is having a framework rather than ley lines being true. They're a framework to describe a true thing, which is that what we call landscape has energetics and personality. And if you do it that way, you can also get insight from feng shui or what have you and see which things are expressing in your area. But I think it's critical to flourishing local communities to have a healthy and robust language of place.
Can we elaborate on that healthy and robust language of place? Because I love the idea of landscape metaphysics. I think we've kind of touched on it a bunch in several different interviews, most notably with author Peter Shampoo talking about his arc-home matrix. And his is more of a circle pattern, almost like a fractal rather than a grid. So I totally understand what you mean, how it's kind of a cultural context. And he talks about that in his book, how his ley lines are somewhat subjective to his observations, but you can use his parameters to maybe find significant energetic features in your own area.
Yeah, then that's a really good example of it then. In the same way that there are certain pattern, and I just think about this, like I think permaculture is this. I'm the outgoing president of Perma-culture Tasmania, and I'm the permaculture designer amongst other stuff, right? So in permaculture, you learn patterns and then you either apply, this is the wrong way of saying it, but like you apply them to a landscape or you arrange landscape in accordance with universal patterns. The direction that water flows and, across a pit of land and the winter and summer, like rising and setting points for the sun and all these kind of, and prevailing weather patterns and all the rest of it. So it's permaculture at its best is a pattern science, right? So that you're actually trying to live in accordance with how the universe is patterned. I would say feng shui is another really good example of that, right? So you might not have Chinese hills and rivers, but there are energetic relationships between certain kind of hills and rivers and the angle of your house. And so that's what I mean by having like a language of place. I would include, I wouldn't want to get more specific than that because it's easy, particularly with normies, to start with like a permaculture framework because as far as they know, you're not doing anything weird. You're just kind of like arranging in accordance with nature, but like what even is nature, right? And then you can kind of move into whichever thing suits. Like if I was building some kind of permaculture community in like outside Glastonbury, somewhere in the West culture, I'd use ley lines, the Michael lines right there. Like that sounds like a really good thing to do, right? But it's more about being, because that's the right thing to do for there. Like the Michael line doesn't come through my farm. So it's more about, again, I don't think, it's a weird way of saying it, but I'll go with it. I don't think you're doing it right if you're trying to apply universals. Like literally the key is for it to be specific to where we are. And so it's really difficult to kind of go back up and go, well, what about this one? And it's like, well, it would depend. The ones that I think are the closest to universal would be quote unquote natural patterns. And I think the guy who invented permaculture, Bill Mollison, who was Tasmanian, so it actually comes from here. I don't think people realize what kind of philosopher he was, because he was in awe of the fact that, and this is real 70s, 80s fractal stuff again, how erosion works and how the shape of a mountain is approximately the same shape as like a pile of dirt on the mountain. And that is weird. It is weird that fractals are true. Like it is weird in that kind of hermetic as above, so below sense, which I think is referring to fractals, that the shape of a river is the same kind of like riverine patterns viewed from above. Whatever angle you get down to heading into the delta, it's that same kind of split. That's weird. It's weird that that is a pattern in reality. And that's kind of a really Platonic idea of there being some kind of like archetypal patterning capacities for the whole cosmos. And it's our goal to live in accordance with them. And I would put feng shui and ley lines as part of that recognition. The patterns include, in fact, are almost always energetic or at the level of the field, so that you can't see them. But like if you don't live in accordance with them, you'll be washed away quite literally in some cases. So that's what I mean. And it depends on what you vibe with and what your local area is. If you're in Southeast Asia, there will be place spirits that you build little houses for and what have you. But it depends. It depends where you are.
Absolutely. Yeah. Wow. Thank you. I didn't expect to get into that as much as we did. And it's really a pleasure, because it's become sort of a through line in the show, and definitely a through line in my life exploring New England. What's been particularly fascinating in New England, and I don't know if they have these in Tasmania, I assume they might, given that you're on a farm, you're probably familiar, but they have these stone rows that in some cases are very benign, very, ubiquitous, and they're just piles of stones that farmers in colonial times built. But then in other cases, we're finding huge, almost megalithic stones in these stone rows, and they're going through new growth forests. They're going through old growth forests. They're going up the side of hills. So I'm kind of trying to decipher this language of these stone rows and maybe see which ones were here before the age of Columbus, we'll put it. But we know there were travelers from other lands way before Columbus. And yeah, do they have stone rows as far as Tasmania?
So no, they don't. There is, so Aboriginal Australia is the oldest continually practiced cultures on Earth. They've been going for more than 50,000 years, right? And so the language of place is very different in Aboriginal Australia, and particularly in Tasmania. The language, it's much closer to feng shui, so that you'll find shell middens and things, but the way Aboriginal Australia was on country, in a country that's made by fire, was very much more like that. So it was a language of timing and time rather than like stone and structures. And so they wait for the first snow to do the kind of cultural burning. And in fact, when Captain Cook was coming up the East Coast, a similar thing happened with Columbus on the East Coast of the US, or Turtle Island. But there was like continuous smoke the whole way up. And this kind of being in relation and understanding the custodial role of arranging and being with country involved fire more than stone here. And when the Europeans first arrived, the landscape, the bush, looked like English parkland. At the time, there was an English park designer called Capability Brown. And the whole idea behind that is you would sort of engineer lovely little hills and standing trees and so on. Rather than formal gardens, you would sort of mimic what the English countryside looked like as a landscape design language. And when the British showed up here, particularly in and around the Sydney area, it was like parkland. So there were these sort of elegantly spaced out trees that you could walk in between, and birds everywhere, and like wildflowers at the base of the trees and so on. And that was all under custodianship of the local tribes of the area. That's how they lived. So instead of building stones, they just made paradise, right? And it's really interesting to find on an archaeological level. Now, there are some like alternative historians who think that there is more megalithic stonework in Australia that either people before the Australian Aborigines or much earlier back actually did, but it was much more of a language of being with country. So it's art on walls, and it's contributing to the flourishing of the whole system as a sort of 50,000 year. I dare to call it technology, because that's kind of our word for it. So there's more, you find the impact of Aboriginal Australia in a good example. So the stonework you will find, prior to contact, they would do things like build watering holes for kangaroo. So not to hunt them, but so that the kangaroo had water. So you'll find structures coming from a pre-colonial time in Aboriginal Australia. And the cosmology is just so different to us. It's like, well, why'd you build that? For the kangaroos. Why were you hunting them? No, they needed a drink. Obviously, they were hunting them, but like the role of humans in an Aboriginal understanding comes back to that custodianship thing of like, we are here to make this place better. And when you apply to a language or to a landscape, that's the wrong word, to country that is made by fire, when you master fire, and you understand it correctly, you are not just like making a gap, but there are plants that require fire to germinate their seeds. Cool fire, not like the massive bushfires we have because we no longer do it. So that you actually improve the plant biodiversity by understanding of cultural burning, but you also open up landscape so that marsupials like the kangaroo can in fact eat. So you're growing the number of animals as well as plants, as well as yourself, that's the Aboriginal technology. And I'm constantly in awe of it. I just think I have this because I wrote another book, Starships, A Prehistory of the Spirits, where I have this idea that older isn't necessarily better. And I think we can all agree with that, but oldest might be the best. And it comes back to that idea of, or that feeling we all have in our bones that like, we used to be better at this. Like whatever this is, we used to be better at it. That's baked into all our cultures. That's the idea of the expulsion from the garden. Like we used to live better than we do now. There's been some kind of fall. That's the story of Atlantis. That's all of that stuff. And if we're going to find it anywhere, it's going to be like Aboriginal Australia has seen of ice ages to be practicing for more than 50,000 years, probably up to 100,000. And we should listen. Like if they learn some stuff, 100,000 years. We're only 2,000 years from Jesus. Like that's 50 Jesus lengths. It's amazing, right? And that I love that. Sorry, I went off on a tear there because I love the idea of how we are with time and place and all that. Yeah,
no need to apologize, Gordon. We're here for it. On the point of the custodial nature of the Aborigines, I see that in my own research of the Iroquois nation that lived where I currently live. And you even have evidence that they were doing very similar things with the forest.
Absolutely.
And the cool burn versus the hot burn, I think that is, absolutely fundamental to symbiosis. Because, I mean, you look at the animals just themselves as a small example, they're all competing with similar food sources. And because of the ebb and flow of the different populations, if there's not enough wolves, well, then the deer overpopulate, they overrun the trees. So the wolves are naturally balancing. And it's interesting to see fire being that balancing agent in Australia, where there's a world, it's a world without mammals.
Plenty of snakes and crocodiles and deadly.
Right. You see this different sort of evolution take place there. So.
Yeah, absolutely. In all cases, and this comes back to, because I wouldn't even use the word compete there. So what is the human, what you have when you look at a trophic system, which you're referring to with like wolves, and which we learned from Yellowstone National Park, right? Reintroducing the wolves changed the behavior of the prey animals, which changed the growth of the trees, which improved the retention of soil on hills, which cleared the water, which allowed the beavers to start building again. So like bringing 12 wolves in did that, because it's not a competitive relationship. That's a 19th century idea. It's like a co-creative custodial neighborly relationship, right? And what is it that humans can bring to a landscape that a kangaroo can't? A kangaroo with its dumb little hands can't be there, with flint starting a fire. So we, the kangaroo, although it is available here, so I can say we, but let's pretend we're Aboriginal Australians. So we eat the kangaroo, and use the plants and so on, and we provide the thing we provide to the niche in the same way that the kangaroo droppings provide for the soil, which provides for the grass. We're not doing that now. We're not doing what they did for 50,000 years, right? And I try to find, and a good example of why I think we should listen and get that right is that, and this isn't quite correct, but it's sufficiently correct that I'm going to say it. When Europeans showed up and tried to find Aboriginal herb lore, like what are your herbalism? What are your healing plants? There kind of wasn't any, or there weren't that many, because they didn't get sick. Right? They had basically the perfect diet, as far as we can tell. They had the perfect amount of sunlight. They were a foot taller than the Brits when they showed up in their boats. So the whole how do you deal with scurvy or diabetes? It's like, well, we don't have them. Right. And so if you look at cultures that have robust herbalism, there's a case to be made that maybe that's an example of actually living in right relation, or maybe that's what's required there. And the fact that you can effectively not have a medicine because how you live is medicinal, I think is something we should think about, right? And that includes the ceremony stuff and just the general happiness of it. Really fascinating to me that there's not, in the same way you find in almost any other culture in the world, a robust medical herbalism, because it's not that they didn't have them. It's not that they didn't have plants that they would use or eat or so on, but there wasn't a category like that because it's just the way they lived before we got here didn't require it.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely been my motto in the past 2 years. I don't need medication. I got meditation, and healthy living is healthy life. And anecdotes like that just go to show that, yeah, we're way off track of what we could be. And yeah, I think that's a great...
In fact, it's a paradise, right? Like you live your entire life. Before we got here, it's warm the whole time. You're just living on the beach, eating super abundant seafood, partying, singing, fucking, whenever you got that. I'm oversimplifying the culture, obviously, but why? What an amazing 50,000 years. So not that we ever get back to that. There's too many of us and we don't live that way or any of that kind of stuff. But there's wisdom in that. There's wisdom in what we individually and as a culture find to be priorities in how the cultures that have lasted the longest actually live.
Right. Well, we are coming to the close here, Gordon. So I definitely want to thank you for joining us. But before we go, I notice you have a really cool series on your YouTube channel. I'm not sure if it's on anywhere else or wherever you can find your content, but I noticed the Lenormand cards. You've been going through...
The Lenormand, yeah.
I imagine you're going through the archetypical parts of the deck one by one, because I noticed just by the titles, it was sort of like Queen, or I think one of them was about the Fool. Am I off there? Can you tell the audience what they can expect to find from the Lenormand card series you're doing?
So a friend of mine, Colin, is a Scottish artist, and I are creating a Lenormand deck. And the Lenormand is a oracle, sort of 18th, let's just say late 18th century oracle. So it's not tarot cards. There are 36 cards in a Lenormand deck. And so each week every 10 cards, we take a week off. We go through, and for people who join live, we talk about that card and what we want on it, and then we see it the next week and so on. And we're coming to the end of that project. And what's happened, so we only got a few cards left, and then I have to finish writing the book, and then we sell it. They're available for sale, and you'll find the links below every video at runesoup.com. But even if you don't want to do that, if you watch from the beginning, each episode, whilst we'll be talking about, what's going to be on the card, gives you a really good understanding of each of the Lenormand cards themselves, but it doesn't have a Fool. It starts with the Rider. But yeah, so that's been really fun. And it's basically just on YouTube. I think it's also, because my YouTube auto publishes to Odyssey, you can find it there. But even if you're not going to watch along live, each episode is a really interesting. I think it's the first time anyone's ever done it. People have done it with tarot, but a weekly deep dive on each of the Lenormand cards. And that will result in a deck and a fortune telling book that will be out sometime this quarter. I want to be more specific, but Animystic's been delayed as well because everything is delayed at this point in time with shipping and all the rest of it. So I'm just going to say this quarter that Lenormand deck will be out. But if you're into Oracle reading or tarot card reading or any of that sort of stuff, it's been a really, really fun project.
Love it. Well, I'm eager to dive into that because, as you could tell by my question, I was not familiar. So thank you for clearing that up. And yeah, I think that's fascinating. I don't have any Oracle decks myself, but my girlfriend does. She has one themed on the goddesses. I think it's like a goddess Oracle deck. But this has been a real fun time, Gordon. Thank you so much. And remind people again where they can find you. Obviously, RuneSoup, you're on Odyssey, you're on YouTube, you got the podcast and all the podcast apps, the same one you're listening to this on. Where else can they find you?
That's it. Everything that ever happens in my life is at runesoup.com. There's some Telegram groups and that kind of stuff, but you can find it all, including booking for energy healing sessions and the rest of it at runesoup.com.
Beautiful. All right, Gordon. Well, thank you so much for joining us here, and thank you for listening, folks out there. Enjoy the moment wherever you are in the now. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for sticking with us here on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And what a conversation with Gordon White. Mapacho, we talked about ayahuasca, we talked about landscape metaphysics, something that we've been talking about a lot on the show lately. And if you like that kind of stuff, go over to our Rockfin because the weather's changed a bit. It's kind of cold out, but as soon as I get back out on a hike, I'm planning on making another survey video. So if you like metaphysics or landscape metaphysics, sign up on the Rockfin and show us some love. Check out our videos there. My own personal investigations into some landscape metaphysics. So it was so cool that came up today. Obviously, Gordon's unreleased, yet to be released book, Animystic, will be touching on that and many other brilliant things. And Gordon, I mean, you heard me say it, he's a brilliant guy. I mean, really well spoken, really clear thinker, and a really, really highly skilled communicator. I mean, some of the concepts that he relayed here in this episode go deep. So don't worry. I too feel like I need to go back and listen to this one again. So show us some love and hit the rewind button. Download the episode twice. Listen to it twice. That'd be freaking sweet. I know I'm going to listen to it. And I usually never do that because for whatever reason, after I record a podcast, I don't typically like to hear my own voice. I do listen to the times that I'm on Tinfoil Hat just because I never want to miss a single episode of Tinfoil Hat. So I cringed my way through the Swarmies episode that I was on, but also I probably said some cringy things there that I only said out of nervousness. I mean, come on. Can you blame me? Sam's a professional comedian. I'm just an average guy who loves conspiracy theories and occult symbols and strange, bizarre stories that make you wonder what kind of reality are we really living in. And this year in 2022, we hope to have more interesting people on the show, more stories like the one we had with Ron Weed, more researchers like the conversation we had with Peter Shampoo, and friends of the show, of course, like the ones we've had with Ron from New England, Alex Stein, even Matt from the Great Deception podcast, Matt Raymer, Chris Matthews, and the homie Romy. That's just in the past few days. And actually, we had a nice little run there where it was all guests that I met in person. Etienne and Owen Hunt. But anyways, on to the next. Gordon White, thank you so much. Be sure to check out his Lee Normand oracle cards that he is creating himself. And a couple things that I wrote down for today's episode. So a lot of loose jackers, a lot of loose jackers out there on the interwaves. Keep hating. It's all love on this end. I never told anybody not to listen to anybody's shows. I just don't endorse what some podcasters choose to do in their personal time and what they qualify as research. Very interesting stuff. Fill in the blanks. I'm not going to talk about it because we're above that. This is a positive show, and we're not going to engage in the truther drama on this show. Hint, hint. Anyways, one of the really interesting synchronicities was that an old friend that I had, Ryan B, is his last name, B. I don't want to give out his identity, but just for clarification's sake, so people don't confuse it with the other person by that name who has come up this week. So my friend Ryan B, back when I was in my college days, we'll say, even though I dropped out, he was not really a fan of my... It's hard to explain, but Ryan and I were really good friends. Ryan B, okay, this is, again, not a podcaster. It's just a weird coincidence that this person has the same name. So Ryan B, we'll call him B. We'll just call him B. So B used to have an apartment that I lived in, and he had a job as a manager of a canvassing group, like a political group, and it was, environmental cause. I was a young, naive dumbass who got involved with that kind of stuff, and really for like a short amount of time, just canvassed and barely made any money. But I had a good time hanging out with B and living with him and his friend Santosh in their apartment. And as we got to know each other, they started to realize, like, oh, Mark's a little strange. Mark's a little weird. He, believes in things that we don't believe in. And so we would have a lot of debates about the nature of reality. We'd have a lot of debates about the nature of life, supernatural, and like the things that I believed in would always clash with what they believed in. I believed 9/11 was an inside job. I felt like it was more than just a belief. It's a fact. But either way, all of these conspiracies and fringe stuff, they're also individual and not mutually exclusive. So it's hard to just like stereotype it all into one category, but you get where I'm going. Well, what's so funny about what B did was B sort of kind of had enough with me at one point, and we kind of had a falling out, and B really, like, even though we were in the same friend group, B just wouldn't talk to me, and it hurt, because I'm the kind of guy who like naively thinks like it can't harm anyone, and you end up harming people, and it hurts. It feels bad, and I regret it. So I apologized, and B's the type of person that didn't really give a fuck about my apology. So either way, what was interesting was when B and I had the falling out, is he offered, he was like, you know what, Mark, like, I really don't agree with, the way you see the world. He's like, you really should read Descartes. Which, when Gordon White brought up Descartes today in today's conversation, it was like a jaw drop, because I mean, exactly what Ryan B was trying to do back in whatever college, by showing me Descartes, was what Gordon explained kind of was the opposite of what Descartes was trying to do. So I thought that was so funny, because, like, that's how I felt when I was trying to convince B that the world was so much more interesting than his logical mind would allow him to say. And Descartes for him was like, oh, see, look, the world isn't supernatural. Descartes proved it. Meanwhile, Gordon White told me straight up today, and told you guys too, you heard it, that Descartes, that was not his intention, but in a sort of cosmic joke kind of way, he ended up, making this really strong case against what he believed in. And that's what I was, Unfortunately, hippie Mark, mystic Mark, You know, that's really who I am. Like I've always been hippie, mystic, and just kind of like taking that thing one step further, you know, whereas most people might be like, oh yeah, I read books and stuff and I like crystals. Like I made that stuff a part of my life, an inextricable part of my life, and I don't regret it. You know, it caused me a little bit of social issues here and there, but with certain people who maybe thought I was strange, but that's fine because now I'm right at home with all of you. So I just thought I'd give a shout out to Ryan Becker. And if you're listening out there, homie, shout out to you. I hope you're I hope you're doing well. So anyways, another interesting connection was Mapacho. Mapacho being this protective, wise teacher. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like the backwoods that I buy at the gas station are Mapacho. But if you took every tobacco leaf that they sell in a gas station and compared them, you might see that the backwoods is the most natural looking and therefore maybe the most conducive for Mapacho. I don't know, but I'll just say that part was particularly thrilling for me because I didn't know that name. I didn't know that was the word that they used to describe the tobacco spirit in the Amazon. And now I feel like I know tobacco a little bit better. I don't want to endorse that people smoke, but I find that smoking tobacco and cannabis together has brought me tremendous insights. And just like Gordon said, it's all about intention and setting your intention. You know, if you go to a concert and you smoke a blunt, you know, don't expect to be sitting down an hour later reading Manly P. Hall. But if you smoke a blunt and you're in a library, buckle up because you're gonna find some cool shit. That's how I approached it, and that's what I used to do with my library, and that's why I've been really obsessed, especially lately, with adding new books to my library. Speaking of which, I just got 2 new books in the mail today. One of them is the second in the Empire of the Wheel series by Walter Bosley and Richard Spence. It's called Empire of the Wheel 2, Friends from Sonora. And then the other book that came in the mail, which I'm very excited about, it's a big book. It's big. It's got an endorsement by Joseph Farrell on the cover. It's called The Handprint of Atlas by Shesh Harry, The Artificial Axis of the Earth and How It Shaped Human Destiny. Wow. And then in light of what we talked about today with Gordon, I think it fits into the landscape metaphysics at the very least. Now, back to Gordon, though. As I mentioned, I picked up his book, The Chaos Protocols. And, you know, Gordon's a big deal, to me at least. And I got a little nervous. Didn't really ask all the questions that I wanted to ask. So I think maybe right now we can go through his book just a tad bit and give you guys some teasers. In case you want to go and buy this book yourself. I think it's definitely worth your while. So the Chaos Protocols, Magical Techniques for Navigating the New Economic Reality. So he's got Chapter 1, Recognizing the Bars. Just another way of saying recognizing that you're in a prison. Chapter 2, A Probabilistic Universe. Chapter 3, Becoming Invisible. 4, Armies of the Dead. 5, Ambivalent Allies Triggering Sync. 6, The Magnificent Game of the King. 7, Wish-Granting Squiggles. And 8, How to Wage a Mind War. Then there's a conclusion and an appendix, but, you know, I want to say that these chapters are not what you might expect from a book that claims to teach you magical techniques for navigating an economic reality. I mean, they're talking about Hermes, they're talking about Anubis, they're talking about an amalgamation of the two called Hermanubis. Bet you never heard of that one before. Shout out to Slick Dissident. Hermanubis, brother. Shout out to Gabe. Gabe, hit me with the fucking breakdown on Hermanubis. Please. I want the numbers. I want a full Slick Dissident report sheet on the word Hermanubis. And if you guys want to know what I'm talking about by a Slick Dissident report sheet, go over to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy Telegram, where my homies are constantly going back and forth, different people every day. There's the same old characters and there's some new faces as well. So join the gang. It's growing, and Slick is always putting some cool info in the chats. So you're missing out if you're not on the Telegram chats. Let's read this. Let's read this here. So, Hermanubis. One of the purposes of running you through a cynocephalic history at some length is to announce that you can get yourself a statue of Saint Christopher from almost anywhere and have a ready-made, almost voodooized home for Hermanubis on your altar. Ideally, try to find one with a lamp, a sacred symbol of Hermes. Ooh, that connects to what I was looking into with Austin, Texas, and how they have a lamp on their flag. That represents Hermes, the messenger. And that's funny because what do we traditionally think of when we think of a lamp? We think of a genie coming out of a bottle or a lamp, right? And he grants you some wishes. It's kind of like a message. I don't know. So, wow. I mean, I'm not going to read anymore because I want you to get this book for sure. But not only does Gordon straight up give you some spells to try out, he and some of my dejectors are going to really hate this. But, you know, when you get this big, when your show's growing, you got haters. That's fine. But the occult dejectors might think that there's some dark symbolism in here. But you know what it is, folks? It's the same argument that conservatives make with guns. It's like, guns don't kill people, people do. Well, by that same logic, occult symbols don't kill people, people do. So let's get that out of the way real quick. And again, not trying to air any dirty laundry here because this isn't the place for it, folks. This is the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast where we vibe on love, brotherhood, truth, sistership as well, but most importantly, truth, and as Gordon put it, right relationship. And I'm glad he brought that word into my zeitgeist, into my vocabulary, that and many other words today. And I think that's key. It's pivotal. How do we find right relationship? I think that's really what the show title is all about. My family thinks I'm crazy because I am trying to live in right relationship with the earth, and they don't even understand what that is. No offense to them. They got a lot of other shit going on. And all credit to them. They're pretty good at doing what they do. I just hope one day people will recognize me for being good at what I do here. So anyways, a lot going on this week. Let me pause here for a second. I think we have a couple new patrons who are definitely going to get spirit animal names. Hold on one second. All right, our Patreon audience is growing every week, so thank you so much for all of those who have joined us. Thank you so much to everyone who supported us, whether you're still with us or not. We love you. And if you want to support the show, go over to myfamilythinksimcrazy.com. There's a bunch of different ways. We have merch, we have art, we have PayPal, we have a Patreon, and a Rockfin with tons of bonus content. And we have a book list. That's right. If you want to do an episode with me, maybe you're a fan of the show, maybe you're another podcaster. Well, I got a really cool idea, I think, for a way that we can do that and not maybe bore each other to death. Let's buy the same book, you know, say, hey, Mark, I got you this book off your list. I'm going to send it to you, and then we're going to do an episode on this topic. That's a great idea. Or maybe you see that you have the same book as one that I already have. In case you didn't know, I do a podcast called The Library of the Mystagogue, where I recommend 5 books from my library each episode. I put 1 or 2 out in December, but I will be putting out 3 a month. So stay tuned for those in January. They're only available on the Patreon. But either way, folks, the book list through Amazon, those are books I don't have yet. So if you're interested in that opportunity, hit me up, say, hey, this is what I want to talk about, whatever. If you can send a book, that's even better. That'll get you a spot on the show immediately. But, you know, I definitely don't want to rule it out if you can't go out of your way and spend money on a book. But keep in mind, folks, this is all coming out of my back pocket. Thanks to the lovely supporters, it's a lot easier, but I do this podcast, all on my own, really, from recording to editing to producing to publishing to promoting to managing and all the other things that go on with this podcast. I'm doing it all. So can't it's a lot easier when I have some help from you folks. So thank you so much. If that sounds cool to you, do it. Buy me a book. But anyways, I'm getting way off track. We have 2 new patrons, and I just want to give them both a shout out. Shout out to you, John B. the second, and shout out to you, Heather. John B., we've got your spirit animal name right here. Ooh. All right. This card is bent, so I don't know if it's coming up in the deck multiple times, but this is a cool synchro because we have a few groups that are forming here. Like there's some dragons, there's some bears. I got another lion, okay? So, John B., you are the whirling lion. You got the whirling rainbow card, which represents unity and wholeness achieved. And you got the lion card. So, you can be the rainbow lion. You can also be the united lion. I just thought whirling lion sounded coolest. So, we're going to go with whirling lion. And, Heather, shout out to you, Heather. Thank you for being a patron. Your spirit animal name is, you are the Coco Pele dolphin, or the fertile dolphin. You got the dolphin card, and you got the Coco Pele card, which represents fertility. Hit up Alex Stein. He's fertile too. Just kidding. Anyways, those are the spirit animal names. If you want one, if you think it sounds cool, if you think it sounds racist, I don't give a fuck. They're spiritual animal names, and if you want one, go over to the Patreon, show some love, and join the family. Get a fun little nickname that you can use in the Telegram chats. It's funny giving out spirit animal names after what Gordon White said at the beginning of this conversation about the term animism, and he's absolutely right. I mean, that was a time where, unfortunately, there was one group of people who thought they were superior to other groups of people that they were, pretty new to interacting with. But for the past 500 years or so, we've had, this sort of destruction of those indigenous cultures. And yeah, Gordon's right. There's only 2 or 3 actual tribes, if we want to really be purists about the term tribe and what a tribe is and what it means to be truly outside of mainstream society, then yeah, there's really only a couple. I mean, there's the guys that are pretty famous on Senegal Island over there in the Indian Ocean. They don't, is it Senegal Island or Sentinel Island? I think it's Sentinel Island. Those guys, they're the ones who, they'll basically spear anybody who comes on their island, so there's no getting to them. And then there's the remote tribes that are still in the Amazon. So yeah, it's sad to talk about that, but I think at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and yes, there are crimes that have happened to groups of people, but I mean, is there one single group of people that has their hands clean? I don't know. I don't know, but I just try to avoid the political stuff because I'm not a genius, I'm not a scholar, and I'm definitely not a social justice warrior, but I have a lot of love for indigenous peoples, indigenous cultures, and whether touched or untouched, the tribes of North and South America. And I think, for all the awful atrocities that have happened, I am grateful that there is still some culture left for us to connect with. And I think I've said this before, but, I was born here in North America, and I feel like the spiritual culture of this continent is more appropriate to me and my spiritual life than maybe the ones that my ancestors had. I don't know, just my stoner thoughts. But either way, this has been a insightful, expansive, and informative episode with Gordon White, host of RuneSoup, author of The Chaos Protocols and the soon-to-be-released Animystic. Be sure to check out his Lee Normand cards, the Oracle cards that are coming out in Q1. Q1, I like how Gordon breaks everything down into Qs. I had no idea what the hell he was talking about when I first heard him talk about Qs. I'm like, is this something to do with QAnon? No, quarter. But anyways, little business. Sounds like some white collar stuff to me. I don't know. Either way, Gordon is a wealth of information, so be sure to go over to RuneSoup and check out everything he's doing. Like he said, runesoup.com is the place to find everything Gordon White. And I definitely recommend checking out his interviews with Greg on the Higher Side Chats, because that's how I first encountered Gordon, and I really appreciate the way Greg interviews his guests. I hope I can achieve that level of professionalism one day with this show and bring my own flair, my own flavor, my own style to the podcasting world, because Greg's show is great. He has definitely inspired this show a ton, as well as my homie Sam Tripoli. Shout out to Sam. If you haven't heard the Swarmies episode, that's right, I was on Tinfoil Hat for my fourth time, second time doing the Swarmies. So go check that out. It is episode, let's see here. Go check out episode 523 of Tinfoil Hat with myself, Sammy T, J Nice, and XG in the place to be. I was also on the show way back last year in, for episode 411, the first time we ever did the Swarmies. I was on episode 395 with Agostino Zoida and David Lugo. And then finally, my first appearance, the infamous episode 377, The Black Magic Legacy of Aleister Crowley, with yours truly. So go check those out if you're a fan of Tinfoil Hat and you're a fan of me. I'm sure you already have. And that does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Have a great moment wherever you are in the now.